Japan actually full-on invaded the Philippines. They didn't do that to Hawaii, but they did to the Philippines until the end of the war.
Yeah. It's just so crazy to know how many times it got invaded and how much war the Filipino people have actually endured. It's just mind-blowing. It is time for part 2. What's up, Philippines? Yes, if you have watched part 1 of how the US stole the Philippines, then you are at the right place right now, because today we're watching part 2, or actually it's the same day, but it's another publishing day. I split those videos up in 2 videos just because it's a very long one and I want to keep your guys' attention, and you know, I like to keep it somewhere between like 10 and 15 minutes, so it's easier for you guys, easier for me. I can still follow the content and just be focused and also be joyful and entertain you guys. So yeah, today we are reacting to How the US Stole the Philippines, part 2. And without further ado, let's jump into it.
Okay, so this is where things really heat up. It's 1900 now, Spain loses the war, obviously, and the US now owns Puerto Rico, Guam, and they claim the Philippines. But the local Filipinos who've been fighting for their freedom for years are like, no. You just waltzed in here on our rebellion and conspired with the Spanish to make it look like you were liberating us. No, this is our country. We don't need another colonizer. And this is where things really heat up.
Whoa.
The Filipinos start fighting again for their independence, and this time against the United States. It is a pretty horrible, bloody war, one that I never learned about in school. It includes massacres of men, women, and children by the United States, and hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. But the US eventually won, and they established a government in the Philippines. Back in the US, the appetite for expansion continued to go down, and people sort of just forgot about the Philippines. They forgot that there was a war there.
Wow.
One newspaper summed it up by saying, Americans didn't know if the Philippines were islands or canned fruit. But the fact remained that the US went to war and now owned the Philippines, in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam. So this begged a very important question, one that hadn't been asked before, which is all of this land America? Are these people Americans? This was a huge question. And the answer to that question affects how we see these territories still today. Okay, so a few years after these wars, there's a guy in New York City who's importing oranges from one of these territories, Puerto Rico. And he's paying tariffs on these imports because, you know, that's what you do when you're importing oranges from another country. Wait a minute.
It's the same country.
This guy was like, didn't we conquer Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines? Isn't that America? The Constitution says that you can't put tariffs on stuff coming from other parts of the US. Like New Jersey can't put tariffs on like avocados from California. So he sued, and his case and a bunch of others like it made it to the Supreme Court. So now the Supreme Court must decide, is this land where we just won a war, is this America? Are these Americans? If they are, do they get all the same rights as other Americans? Do they get to vote? Do they get to participate in the US economy without tariffs, like any other state does? And honestly, this isn't a question about oranges and tariffs. The real question at stake here is America the land of the free where all are created equal, or are we an empire? No different than any other empire that scoops up colonial possessions in war and rules the people, who are usually black and brown, as subjects, not fully a part of the country. That was the question that was at stake. And in this series of cases in the early 1900s, the Supreme Court decided that America was the latter. This
video is so interesting. I didn't watch such an interesting video in a very long time.
Where the people don't have any representation in the democracy, but where Congress could create laws on their own, particularly laws dealing with revenue, which would not be allowed by the Constitution for states within the Union. We can create revenue laws, stuff that's totally unconstitutional for other parts of our country. In other words, unincorporated territories are land we control and exploit for revenue, but whose people don't get to vote and don't get the right to trial by jury.
It's very, very interesting what he just said. When I was in Mexico, I went to this fruit market, and something that they said it stuck with me. So they said they have this very high quality fruits and vegetables from these farms that are just really amazing, and they send it to the US. In the US, they label it as fruits from the US because it's a US territory. But Mexico has to pay tax on it for importing or exporting in this case. It's really messed up, isn't it?
So yeah, the Philippines, in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam, remained unincorporated territories.
Oh, yeah, and what they said, that was the actual thing. What they said was they exported to the US, and then the US exports it back to Mexico and sells it as product from the US to sell it at a higher price. And people in Mexico see products from the US as higher quality, so they are more eager to buy that. So yeah, it's crazy. It's so messed up.
A place that the US could kind of just ignore without a lot of consequence. They weren't important enough or strategic enough to be considered to become states like Hawaii or Alaska. So they sort of faded from American consciousness. Like, this is why we never heard about this in school. Like, it didn't make it into the history books in any salient way.
Yeah.
And how far the Philippines had faded from people's minds became very
haven't
clear
heard that
in
much
December
about the
of
Philippines.
1941. During World War II. The US had owned the Philippines for like 40 years when a fleet of Japanese bombers flew across the Pacific and bombed an American naval base in Hawaii.
And the severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
But what we don't really remember is on that day, Japan bombed Guam and the Philippines, two American territories,
wow.
as well as several other American and British territories.
Yesterday,
Not much spoken about.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Here's the draft of this speech. This is the original draft that FDR spent the day marking up before he gave it. Zoom in a little bit and you'll see on this draft that it mentioned the Philippines originally, but FDR crossed it out. He crossed out the mention of Manila. Yes, the Philippines
Wow.
was on some map somewhere. Yes, we technically owned it, but the people really didn't want to hear about it because these people weren't Americans. The Supreme Court had decided that.
Wow.
They weren't going to become states anytime soon. So why mention them? After that day, Japan actually full-on invaded the Philippines. They didn't do that to Hawaii, but they did to the Philippines until the end of the war,
Yeah.
at which point the Philippines were finally granted independence in 1946. Fast forward to today.
It's just so crazy to know how many times it got invaded and how much war the Filipino people have actually endured. It's just mind-blowing. It's like no wonder people have such a high resilience because they've been through so much. It's generational trauma. It's just crazy.
The Philippines were
Wow.
finally granted independence in 1946. Fast forward to today, and this "we own you, but you're not really Americans" precedent established by the Supreme Court still applies to 4 million people who live in unincorporated territories. Or let's just call it a spade a spade. Let's call them what they are. These are colonial possessions. The people who live here don't experience the full rule of law. They don't get trial by jury. They don't have full representation in our democracy. And they don't get to vote for the president. This is why when a hurricane hits Puerto Rico, the government response is not nearly what it should be. The way
God, that
Trump
guy.
talked about Puerto Rico as almost
Throwing
another country
towels like
is not a part of us.
basketball.
Mirrors exactly how the Supreme Court talked about these unincorporated territories. They're for revenue, not to compete with American farmers. We conquered these places, but we didn't want to bring the people fully into the American project. We left them out. And there
Wow.
they remain today.
I'm blown away by this video, by the way. It's just, like I said, one of the best videos that I've watched so far about like the summary of the history of the Philippines. I wonder if he has any more videos. I would love to watch more. And I also remember going to Rizal Park and I did this whole tour there and it was quite eye-opening. So if you have the chance, if you're visiting Manila, please go to Rizal Park and do the tour and then also Intramuros. It's part of the history, part of the culture as well to understand the Philippines, and now I can connect all the dots. I hope you can connect the dots too, and I hope you learned something new today. And with that being said, I I hope next video will be a fun one so we can smile again, we can share some good vibes. But you know, that's the quintessence of this channel. I want to learn something new, I want to educate you guys, I want to entertain you as well. So I hope we can cover a lot of topics. If you have any recommendations, of course, let me know in the comment section down below, as always. And I'll see you guys next video on What's Up Philippines? Bye bye.